NFL statistical discourse still sucks in the year 2024.
Trying to say is that 509 yards is an aberration. We ain't seen that from anybody since but Tom Brady in 2011 against the Miami Dolphins since the 1970 merger.
Sewell and Glasgow, it's not even close. It's not in Zeitler, it's not even close. Offensively, they're fourth in offensive yards per game, they're fifth in passing yards, sixth in rushing, fourth and third downs.
Ground and pound. And it still works. And by the way, you hit it on the head. Their defense finally showed up.
That's right.
Because they were dead last in the NFL in pass defense. Yep. And guess what? I know they're way better than that. And so
now, these point to two broader problems. First is mistaking correlation for causation, and second is our tendency to cherry pick numbers to support existing narratives that we already believe. These problems exist outside of the NFL, but they're pretty prominent here. And they're made worse by the fact that the general stats the public has the best access to and knows the most about don't really tell us very much that's useful. That's notably in contrast to basketball, where I think most people understand offensive and defensive efficiency. Today, we're going to talk about how expected points added per play can help you better understand what's taking place on the field while improving your sports betting results. But before we get into the specifics, I really want to talk about this Rex Ryan example. It's in here for a reason. He said that the Ravens were the number 32 passing defense in the league, but that he knew they were better than this. Now, credit to Rex Ryan for not trying to cherry pick a more favorable data point to support his argument. But let's unpack exactly what numbers he's talking about here. So, Baltimore's defense, in terms of passing yards per game allowed, heading into week 4, they were god-awful. They were giving up 291.7 over their first 3 games. The second worst defense, 255.7, 36 fewer yards. Now, maybe this isn't that historically bad. Let's take a look at 2023. Oh, yeah. The worst defense gave up 262.2. And how about 2022? Yeah, 274.8. So, not very good, Baltimore. And yet, Rex Ryan knew that they would do better than this. So, if we're putting a lot of stock in yards per game, well, these are really bad numbers. But one important note that I have here is it's a 3-game sample size. That doesn't give us that much to work with. And number 2, let's zoom out here. Maybe the issue wasn't caused by Baltimore's bad secondary. Instead, maybe the Baltimore secondary gave up so many passing yards because other teams were throwing the ball constantly against them. After all, the Ravens got out to an early lead in week 1 and an early lead in week 2 and an early lead in week 3. Maybe the secondary isn't bad at all. We need to ask how often opposing teams were throwing the ball against Baltimore. And when we look at that number, yeah, the Ravens must have given up a lot of passing yards if opposing teams were running 70+% of passing plays. They're going to give up some yards. And if all of the yards Baltimore is giving up are coming through the air, then obviously their yards per game in terms of passing would be pretty heavily skewed, which raises another important question. How bad was Baltimore on a per play basis? Instead of a 3-game sample, this gives us 100+ examples to work with. Through week 3, the Ravens have played around I think 114 plays of defense. And we see that Baltimore ranked 28th while copying up 7.5 yards per pass attempt. It's not good, but it's not the historically bad number that yards per game would have led us to believe, which was reinforced by mistaking correlation with causation. Now, let's circle back to what Rex Ryan said. He said they were number 32, but he knew they were better. That gut feeling that the Baltimore Ravens defense wasn't as bad as that passing yards per game number suggested was right. And that's really what I want to unpack in this video, is how do we know what we know? Because Rex Ryan knew something, even though the data, the bad data that he was using, said the opposite. So let's start off by talking about expected points added per play. You've probably seen a chart like this floating around on social media before, but you may or may not actually understand what it means. And if you're like me a few years ago, you were going to pretend that you knew what it meant because you didn't want to admit that you didn't understand what was going on. But expected points added, while it's complicated, shouldn't be that intimidating. I would really encourage you to think of it like offensive efficiency in basketball. Or I guess both offensive and defensive efficiency in basketball. It's not that hard to understand. Now, EPA has been popularized by a former Seahawks beat writer for The Athletic, Ben Baldwin, who is a must-follow on X. All of these graphs that you're going to see in this video are from RBSDM, runningbacksdon'tmatter.com, which is a site that he built. So yeah, when you first take a look at this chart, you'll notice that there's a few good teams, a few bad teams, and a whole lot of mid in between, which is actually a pretty good picture of the NFL. But what is this actually measuring? Well, let's break this down term by term. So, expected points. Expected points are the value in points of a given down and distance based on historical scoring output from that down and distance. Take a look at this chart. The closer you get to the goal line, the more expected points of possession is worth. And as you can see, fourth down, even if you're relatively close to the goal line, is usually worth about 3 points, which corresponds to a field goal. Shocking. Now, we're talking about expected points added. So expected points added are the value an offense or a defense generates or a defense prevents relative to these down and distances. A 99-yard drive from your own 1-yard line certainly has a lot more of expected points than a 1-yard run from your own from the opponent one to get a touchdown. Sure, you scored the 6 points, but you were expected to do that. That's not a surprising outcome. Whereas if you started from your own one and you got all the way down the field and scored a touchdown, that is very unexpected. That takes a lot of skill, and we should reward an offense for doing that. Likewise, we should reward a defense for preventing teams from getting close to the goal line, which this also does. So that raises another point. Turnovers are huge in EPA, which can cause some major bias, especially in small samples and early in the season. So take that into account when you're trying to think about the EPA stats so far this season. Now, we're talking about expected points added, allowed, and generated per play on a per play basis. So that's the other necessary part that I alluded to earlier, is that when we are looking at a game by game basis, our sample size is necessarily reduced. Before we start applying expected points added per play, I want to flag that it's not a perfect stat. No one in the NFL data analysis or sports betting space would argue as such. And I know if you've watched Moneyball, you think, oh, maybe these end-all be-all stats exist. Like, that's how they treat it on base percentage. Number one, that's not actually what happened. And number two, if anyone tells you that they have the number one answer to anything or the number that'll predict everything, they're lying to you. But before we talk about these limits, I want to emphasize that EPA per play, even with these limitations, is still far better than the numbers that make up the majority of the NFL statistical discourse. You don't need to be a data scientist to understand EPA per play. Hopefully you already do, given the explanation I just gave you. You may need to be a data scientist to understand the next minute or so of this video, so bear with me here. But the two problems with looking at EPA that I want to flag before we start applying it, one is opponent adjustment. EPA is generally, at least in the most accessible forms of the stat, does not adjust for opponent quality. It's pretty easy to get a ton of EPA if you're playing only bad teams. Likewise, it's pretty hard to get a lot of EPA if you're playing only good teams. There are other stats like DVOA that do a better job of this. DVOA being, of course, defensive adjusted value over average. So, or defense, not defensive. Defense adjusted value over average. That adjusts for opponent quality. EPA does not. There is some work done on how we can improve EPA to that point. You can read this paper here. Next, regression to the mean. So, because the game of football features a ton of high variance outcomes like miraculous interceptions or fluky fumble recoveries, EPA can get kind of noisy. Take a look at this article from Open Sports Football where we see that when we talk about EPA, it is a kind of noisy stat, especially when we try to split it out over a small sample. So the best thing that you can do when it comes to thinking about EPA is to look at an outlier and not put a ton of faith in that outlier being exactly true. Yes, let's say the Bills have an EPA that's twice as good as the next best team. That's meaningful, but that doesn't mean that they're going to keep being twice as good. They might be, 1.5, 1.2 times as good as the field, but that 2 times number is probably not sustainable. And my favorite part of this article comes at the end, these 2 sentences. So the first sentence that's fully on the screen, yeah, that kind of supports my argument. The second sentence, this model is still a work in progress. No one in the data analysis community is going to ever tell you that their model is perfect. They're going to acknowledge constraints, limitations. So don't ever think that anyone coming at you with numbers knows everything. We don't. We don't even pretend to. We just know a little bit more than what the bad stats being used by everyone else would tell you. Cool. Now let's talk about actually applying EPA per play. Here's an example. Take a look at this chart. So Team A, they've got 510 total yards, 287 passing yards, 123 rushing yards. Meanwhile, Team B has 415 total yards, 272 passing yards, and 143 rushing yards. if you're taking a yards per game approach to understanding what's taking place on the field, you probably think Team A won. They didn't. They may have led the 2023 playoffs in yards per game, but they played one playoff game before going home because these are the Dallas Cowboys. And one thing that we can do to better understand what happened in this game is to take a look at the yards per play production. Shockingly, the Cowboys did not get that many yards per play. They needed 89 plays to generate those yards, whereas the Packers only needed 54. That's pretty impressive, Green Bay. And when we take a look at the EPA data, we see that Green Bay thoroughly dominated the Dallas Cowboys. Now, take a look at these three ways of understanding the game. If you only use a yards per game based approach, you probably lean Dallas. Yards per play approach, you definitely lean Green Bay. Here, you see that Green Bay probably won in a blowout, and that is what they did. So, EPA is a better descriptor of what took place on the field than both yards per play and yards per game. Now, you may not believe me on the yards per game or the yards per play point because this example doesn't really support that much. But remember when I talked about how if your offense gets the ball on the 1 yard line, they're not generating a lot of expected points, and they're also not generating a lot of yards? That's going to be important here. Let's talk about another game. Here we've got Team A recording 402 total yards on 5.1 yards per play and 36.5 minutes of time of possession, while their opponent, Team B, had 193 total yards, 3.9 yards per play, and possessed the ball for 23.5 minutes. Given everything that you know, you probably expect that Team A won. You know, they controlled the clock. They ran more plays. They generated double the yardage. In fact, more than double the yardage. And they did so on more than 1 extra yard per play. Except Team B won, 24-16. And they did so without any defensive or special teams touchdowns. Take a look at the EPA chart for this one. This is last year's Commanders-Falcons game. The Commanders won this one despite barely doing anything on offense. How did that happen? Well, they didn't have to be very efficient. The Commanders actually got a ton of not goal to go, but like pretty close to goal to go possessions. Their 3 touchdowns came on drives of 2 plays and 27 yards, 3 plays and 11 yards, and 7 plays and 52 yards. And they got a field goal. Not particularly inspiring offense, but they won 24-16, which is an 8-point margin. The Falcons could not have won the game on their final drive. That's pretty impressive. And that speaks to the value of using EPA to understand what is actually taking place on the field. These numbers are all far, far, far more significant in understanding what actually took place than just the yardage stats. Cool. Let's bring it all together. So, the point of this video is to try to convince you that EPA per play is a far more accurate descriptor of what happens on the football field than most of the stats you'll hear about, like traditional yards per play, yards per game, etc., like you heard from Rex Ryan in the intro. EPA per play, while still limited without opponent adjustment and especially early in the season or over a small sample size, limited by high variance plays, is a much better way to understand what's going on in the NFL. And in my opinion, it can help us make predictions, which we kind of need to do if we're hoping to make effective, profitable sports bets. And I'm going to prove to you that it can help you understand what's actually taking place on the field. So I'm going to run through, I think, the last 3 or 4 seasons of Super Bowl winners and Super Bowl runners-up, and we're going to find them on this team tiers chart by EPA. Now, last year's Super Bowl, pretty easy to remember. That was Chiefs-Niners, and here those guys are. So pretty clear that teams that are good at EPA did pretty well in the postseason. Was that true the year before that? Well, yes. How about the year before that? A little bit less so, but this was a weird year and everyone acknowledges that. But yes, shout out the Tennessee Titans for winning the first seed in the AFC and throwing everything off. How about this season? Also yes. So I want to wrap this video up by proving that even in the middle of the season, EPA can help you make better NFL predictions, especially over a more than 1 game sample size. We're going to go back to, I think this is week 10 of 2022. And I've got the Jacksonville Jaguars circled because they look like a pretty mid team. They look like they're probably going to contend for a playoff spot, but they could easily miss out. Except the Jaguars were 3-7, and they weren't close to leading the division. Where were their division opponents at this point? Well, that's where they were. Jacksonville was considered a pretty big long shot to make the playoffs or win the division this year. And if you remember, not only did they win the division, which took a pretty crazy ending in Tennessee, thank you Josh Dobbs for that fumble, they also won a playoff game. So when you understand EPA as opposed to yards per game or yards per play or whatever other generic stat you might be using, you can get some pretty good insight into what may happen in the future in the NFL. And that's kind of what matters when you're looking to place sharp sports bets. If you're interested in learning more about expected points added per play and using it to find winning bets, subscribe to my picks package on Tales by Oddshopper called The Prophet Isaiah. You'll get access to my bets, a Discord server where I'll be working on an NFL betting model, and full access to me to ask whatever questions you may have. I'd love to see you pop in there. Use code TPI50 to take half off your first 2 weeks or months. And looking forward to meeting y'all.